I'm William E. Simpson. I am the Executive Director of Wild Horse Fire Brigade. I'm coming to you live from our research center up here in the Cascade-Siskiyou Mountains above Wairika, California, an altitude of about 3,000 feet on the southern edge of the Soda Mountain Wilderness. We have a herd of horses that have been here as far as cultural archaeological records go. The old journals and the newspapers go back to the early 1800s. And so this herd that I'm on is about 150 wild horses up here. And it's kind of about 70 miles southeast of Ashland and roughly 60 miles northeast of Wairika, if that gives you an idea where we are. Our horses up here we have mixed phenotypes. We've got Appaloosas, we've got some Kygers, we've got some Iberians. We do have some interbreeding from horses that have basically escaped some ranches locally. So there's a little bit of Arab blood in the herd. So we've got this real colorful herd of horses to look at. It's a lot of fun. So that's kind of the overview here. And I'm going to see if I can make my slideshow advance. So I moved up here in 2014, having returned from a 4-year voyage in the Sea of Cortez. And what struck me immediately was the vibrant wilderness ecosystem here. A lot of different animals, tremendous amount of bird life. I think we've got a dozen different kinds of raptors. We have different kinds of bats. I mean, just the diverse ecosystem is amazing up here. And that's probably why they actually protected the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, which is just 2 miles to the north of our research station. We have a lot of unusual flora and fauna in the area. We still have beavers, mountain lions, bears, coyotes, and wolves that do depredate our herd of horses from the time they're foals up until the time they're even adults. Some of the bears up here are still 400 pounds, and the lions, of course, up here, we've documented lions that were 200 pounds, and so they will take the adult horses. Our population of horses has been fairly stable. We haven't seen any big jumps due to the natural depredation up here. And we do have, in California, we do have a noted collapse of the deer population, which puts probably more pressure on our horse herd here. We heard Dr. Linkletter's explanation of American wild horses, so I'm not going to go into that very far, other than as him and I, we have a real friendly debate about origins of horses and did they actually go extinct or not. And talking to different scientists that I've run into, there's a lot of genetic data that they call outlier data that's not within the realm of basically curated, documented types of horses. So there's some unusual genetics out there that pop up every once in a while when they do large samplings. Our herd, one of the things we do want to do with our herd, because arguably, according to Dr. Yvette Running Horse Collin, in her doctoral dissertation, she mentions that allegedly Sir Francis Drake's expedition party noted there were horses in this area on the California-Oregon border in 1580. So that's pretty close to when Columbus, you're talking about 80-some years between the first, pre-Columbian horses. So we're very interested in the genetics, and I'm sure we're going to find cavalry horses and a bunch of other things. But I'm very interested to see if there's some unusual genetics in this herd. Moving forward here. So one of the big problems we see on the landscape today with the management of our wild horses in the herd management areas that were established in 1971 when President Nixon signed the Wild and Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act, is the fact that since 1971, the economic demands on our public lands have accelerated. We have a growing population that wants more and more goods and services, and a lot of the raw materials are coming from our public lands in America. And so, this screen that I have up now just kind of gives you a general idea. For instance, a lot of people don't realize that the pharmaceutical industry depends heavily on a lot of petroleum distillates that come out of the wells that they're drilling. They're looking for gas, oil, minerals. There's a lot of people that benefit from that. You talk about the Tesla cars and the batteries. Well, lithium. They're determining there's quite a bit of lithium in Nevada now, and of course, when you've got a non-commercial herbivore competing in an economic space with other commercial enterprises, it quickly becomes an economic battlefield, because the non-commercial herbivore is seen as having little or low value, and compared to the other things in that landscape. So that's been a problem for horses, and a lot of times the BLM or the livestock industry get hammered because of their use or their applications on the public lands, and you look at these various industries. Why are they in business? Why are the livestock people in business? Why is Tesla in business? It's because people want those products. And that demand from the consumer side is not going to go away. In fact, it'll probably escalate even further than we see today. So the horses are caught on a boxed-in landscape based upon science that we had that was in the late 50s and 60s, which basically directed how we established our herd management areas, and when they were formalized in 1971. So the long story here is horses have been mismanaged, and it's a matter of consumerism versus the horses. I don't like to point the fingers at anybody, because it really doesn't get a lot done. These people using the public lands wouldn't be using it and trying to make a profit off it if the consumers weren't demanding those products. So if we all suddenly decided that tomorrow, I think 97% of Americans eat meat, if we could just flip a switch and tomorrow nobody wanted meat, that would probably take a lot of grazing pressure off public lands, but that will not happen. I was a vegetarian in 1971 and looked into the statistics then, and 2% of Americans were vegetarians back in 1971 when I was at Oregon State. Today it's 3% of Americans, so that needle hasn't moved very far, very fast. So really, what's the solution? People have struggled with what to do with wild horses on the public lands. And, we kind of got into this whole roundup mentality, just round them up. And if you can adopt a few out, that would be great. But the adoption rates and the race sanctuaries can take horses in is a fraction of what's being removed from the landscape. Like last year, I think over 20,000 horses were rounded up, and the BLM claims that about 8,000 were given homes. Now, with regard to the adoption rates that the BLM claims, there's another aspect of that it's really kind of dark, because we're finding a lot of BLM branded horses, and when they round them up, they brand them, they put a freeze brand on their necks, so they're readily identifiable. And of course, they inoculate them, and then they gild the stallions and sterilize the mares, and then they get sent off. Geldings one direction, mares another, babies another. So the families are broken up. It's really, in a sense, it's very inhumane and inconsiderate of their social. They're very social animals. Family is everything to these animals, and living among them, as I have now for 9 generations of horses, I see these very tight family bonds that you just don't see casually on a field trip with binoculars, or you're never going to see it, of course, in horses that are rounded up already. You have to be out with them day after day to start identifying various family bands and realizing, who's the lead mare, who's the stallion, what's going on in the harem. And then you start to see this very cohesive, loving family. And they're very intelligent animals. They have a very large brain. Their brains are 2/3 the size of a human brain, and 4 times the size of a dog's brain, if that gives you any idea. I've got a really smart dog, an Australian Shepherd, and the horses around here have a brain that's 4 times that size. So that's computing capacity. And so when we split up these families, we're doing things that really is in a very meaningful way inhumane. And you can imagine somebody tearing you away from your family. So there's been a struggle. What do we do? What do we do with these horses? And rounding them up and then putting them in government holding and spending over $100,000 a year feeding them hay. That's a very expensive and it's a very limiting solution because those horses they're basically at the end of their life cycle. There's no longer going to be any progeny from those horses. The other solution being floated widely is for what they call fertility control. Now, fertility control impacts horses in many ways. First of all, and when we talk about natural selection, a lot of people think in terms of just predators, but in reality, natural selection is the entire environmental pressure on the horse. It's everything around them: disease, weather, grazing abilities, and predation, just to name a few. There's also natural selection that occurs in bachelor bands. They're like knights jousting for the hand of the princess. So if you don't have enough bachelors in the competition, the question is do you have a true champion? It'd be like having the Olympic Games and you just have, in the 100-yard dash, you have 5 runners from around the world randomly picked and they compete and then you just crown champion. Is that truly the fastest person in the world? Probably not even close. So when you reduce populations or limit breeding with fertility control, you're interfering with natural selection, which requires a diverse number of horses to test. They have to be tested. And this allows for the best genetics to go forward to maintain genetic vigor. Without a large enough population on the landscape of intact horses, male and female, natural selection cannot work properly. And so when you start managing herd sizes down to 100, they talk about AML, appropriate management level. That's a term that the BLM, they'll arbitrarily determine how many horses should be on a landscape. And generally speaking, it's below the minimums established by other organizations and even below their own Wild Horse and Burro Management Handbook. There's actually a BLM Wild Horse and Burro Management Handbook. And in that book, I think it's on page 28, they talk about genetic diversity and to maintain, according to Gus Cothran at Texas A&M, the geneticist who developed this model for the BLM to put into their plan, you need about 150 to 200 breeding horses. Well, or horses in the herd to have enough breeding horses at that time. So, when you're managing your AML with a herd size at 100 or below or 50, for instance, right here where I am is the Pokegama herd management area. And they claim the appropriate management level of horses up there is 30 to 50 horses. Well, that's a tiny fraction of what Gus Cothran said is required. And then if you look at the International Union of Nature Conservancy, IUCN, they actually have upgraded. They were saying that you needed 500 adult horses to have enough breeding to maintain some sort of genetic diversity. They've actually just upgraded that to 1,000. So we need to start looking at what are we going to do with these horses. And of course, when you keep horses in an area where predators have been eliminated to enhance livestock production, what have you done? Well, you've taken away one of natural selection's tools. Predation is one of those important tools. And of course, what happens? Horses overpopulate on this artificially managed landscape. When you eliminate their predators, they do the same thing livestock do. They overpopulate. So in California, and getting to a potential solution, Dr. Linkletter talked about how horses digest and how they have, in fact, one of the statistics that I ran into a long time ago is that an 800-pound cow and an 800-pound horse, when you look at those on the landscape, the horse is going to need 20% more forage because of their incomplete digestion. They're just really bad at digesting whatever they eat. So they need a lot of it all the time, and that makes them move a lot. So they graze differently on the landscape. A ruminid can eat, and then they can lay down and ruminate, and they get the most out of their food. So when we look at the West Coast, and I mean, of course, we're seeing this everywhere, and even in Canada and Alaska, the evolution of wildfire. there's quite a bit of science out there published that says when you have a collapsed herbivory, you see an escalation in catastrophic fire, and vice versa. When you recapture the herbivory or increase the herbivory, you can devolve wildfire. Now, today, the problem we have is there's very few tools to address all the grass and brush out in the wilderness. And so, looking at all that grass and brush, you can't burn it because we were already producing a lot of hydrocarbons into the atmosphere. And there's, for instance, in California, you have 93 million acres. There's about roughly 30 million acres of fairly remote wilderness. Are you going to burn 30 million acres of landscape every 2-3 years? No, you're not. You'd be lucky if you could even burn 100,000 acres. So these fires are growing, and we have to do something about it. We know the herbivory works. We know fire. We understand how fire works. You need three components. You need the heat, oxygen, and fuel. You fight fire by removing one of those components. And a lot of people misinterpret wind does not fuel fire. Wind just injects more oxygen to the fuel load faster. You cannot have fire without fuel. That's a simple part of fire management. Most of the fuels we're seeing, and I'm going to move out of the way here so you can see this screen, is and I hope all this is coming through. This is a slide from InsaWeb. They track wildfires. This was a big fire we had up here not too long ago called the McKinney Fire. And over here on the right side, they talk about the fuels involved. And there's some timber and understory, but tall grass 2.5 feet, brush 2 feet tall. Okay, that fire ended up being over 60,000 acres, grass and brush. It wasn't grazed by livestock, and we have a collapse of the herbivory here in California. When you look at the collapse here from 1990, when we look at this line on the right-hand side of this graph, we see a downward trend in the population of deer in California, and this is from Deer Friendly. The problem we're facing with our ongoing collapse of the herbivory is additional ungrazed fuel. And if we look at this graph here from a study that was published at Science Magazine, we see the increase is inversely proportional to the decrease in the herbivory on the landscape. We're seeing more forest fires, and we're seeing a lot more grass and brush fires. So there is a direct correlation, which a lot of the science shows. There's a lot of published science. There's just a few examples I have on this screen. If you Google, herbivory wildfire, brings up all kinds of stuff. But it's well known that when you use grazing, you can reduce your fire fuels, and it's user friendly. In the deep wilderness, though, and I used to be in livestock production, you can't use livestock because of depredation. If your calves and your lambs and your breeding cows get eaten, you lose money. So in the deep wilderness, nobody wants to put their livestock out there. This is an ideal place to relocate our excess horses because we have plenty of them. I think there's 90,000 wild horses currently being held off range by the BLM and paid, and they're getting paid to hold them. They feed them. We're spending $100 million a year. Every year. They're held off range. Well, we could redeploy some of those horses. Additionally, under HR 1625, an existing law, when a horse becomes excess is the moment we do an excess determination, and a land manager signs a document that says, I've determined there's this many excess horses on this herd management area where the BLM manages these horses. The moment we have that document signed, those horses are deemed excess legally and become fair game under the HR 1625 humane transfer of excess animals. So it'd be pretty easy to work a cooperative pilot where we get the BLM working with the U.S. Forest and move horses that are deemed to be excess into areas that have their natural predators, remote wilderness, where these horses can then manage some of these excess fuels and reduce the cost of fighting our fires and save homes and ranches. Horses are definitely keystone herbivores. They enhance all the flora and fauna in their ecosystem. I see that here all day, every day. Their dung, we see all kinds of things coming out of their dung. They spread, they're very good reseeders, and they put seeds in new areas. They populate new areas. And so the native plants have a chance to find new niches to establish themselves because of the way horses go around the landscape. And the sequestering carbon is a really big thing. Each horse grazes about 5.5 tons of rough forage, grass and brush every year, and they turn that back into the ground, and their dung contains microbiome and the seeds, and it's kind of like a little potted plant. When you break open the little dung balls and you look at it under this dissection microscope, it's really amazing. It's just like a little microbiome of the ecosystem. So, and of course, what benefits from all the reseeding that they do? Everything, including the pollinators, the bees, the butterflies, the other herbivores benefit, the lagomorphs, the cervids, because they're reseeding the food, the vegetative material that everybody needs to use. That's what makes them a keystone herbivore. And I've got some pictures here. This is a dung pile. Actually, it's a stud pile. Horses mark over each other by putting their droppings on top of each other. Dogs will pee over each other. Horses, the studs, will put droppings over. But this is a fire break on the far left in this slide, is a fire break that was created by wild horses up in the Cascade-Siskiyou Monument. These fire breaks actually helped us stop the Klamathon fire. It gave CAL FIRE an opportunity to bring equipment into a low fuel area and establish themselves and go toe-to-toe with the fire. And we actually saved an old growth forest in the monument from this total incineration. And on the far right is an actual tree that was used by horses as a shelter. Horses use trees for shelter year round. So they break off all the low limbs. They call those low limbs fire ladders because they're big and scratchy. And they graze off the fuel down below. So the fire actually burned under the trees without harming the trees. Any tree used by a horse for a house, the fire burned under it and did not harm the tree. They didn't become matchsticks. Other trees that were not utilized by wild horses did become matchsticks during that fire. And I documented exactly what happened. I was on that fire line 9 days as a volunteer. I was a local knowledge advisor to CAL FIRE. We can implement Wild Horse Fire Brigade. There's two paths, HR 1625, and we could also do it by an amendment of Section 1339 of the 1971 Act and just change a sentence in there and say that the BLM has the ability to rewild horses into appropriate wilderness areas that are not creating any kind of economic battlefield. You know, if you move them out of the areas where they're in conflict, and they're going to get rounded up one way or another, if we move them into these wilderness areas where they can be wild and free and then reestablish themselves in their natural roles as keystone herbivores, everybody wins. This is a win-win for everybody. The livestock people get more grazing. The forest people don't have timber burning and forests on fire. The landscape benefits, the fisheries, because when we have fires, you have catastrophic soil erosion that goes in, fills up all the spawning beds, and the fish all die. By reestablishing these horses into the right areas, they can be a very useful tool and basically reestablish these natural grazing ecosystems that are now gone. I mean, we're in the sixth mass extinction. If we don't start managing the herbivory correctly, we won't have any forests or actually any grazing lands to begin with. You look at Texas, burned to the ground, 1 million acres. How much money would it cost to do this? Well, not a lot. I'm hoping we can sit down with the BLM and work out a pilot program. We're already grazing livestock in the U.S. Forest Service right here in Siskiyou County using a memorandum of understanding agreement because the Forest Service has categoric exemption from CEQA and NEPA if the forest is in jeopardy of destruction from fire. So we're already doing ruminant grazing on the edges where it's safer for livestock. We have the opportunity to set up some pilot programs, and we could start out with some of the horses that are sterilized. If people are worried about overpopulation, they shouldn't, because we know from 10 years of empirical study with my herd, our herd is stable at about 150 horses after 10 years. Okay, according to statistics, our herd should, if it doubles every 4 years, we should be up to, 700-800 horses. We're not. And that's because we have depredation. There are a lot of places in the Pacific Northwest where there would be no conflict with wild horses. We could put them out there and they will reduce the fire fuel, and we will save forests doing that and save a lot of taxpayer money. In summary, what we're hoping to do at Wild Horse Fire Brigade is to do several things to end the range war, to let wild horses have a chance to live wild and free in the right ecosystems. We don't want to have them commingled with livestock. That is not the right way to manage wild horses, commingled with livestock. It creates all kinds of problems, and I could spend an hour just on that problem. But we have an opportunity with our plan, Wild Horse Fire Brigade, to do quite a bit with one move on the chessboard. That we could make a lot of people happy, and we can save a lot of wild horses. It doesn't take much land. We've got just in a couple of states up here in the Pacific Northwest, we probably have 50 million acres of remote wilderness where we don't have any tools in the box to fight fire or reduce fuel. When we get a fire, it's going to burn catastrophically. You can't do prescribed burning because the fuel's so prodigious now. It pasteurizes the soil 7 inches deep. You get hydrophobic layers in the soil. It kills all the microbiome and makes the sterile soils, which are no longer productive for any of the co-evolved fauna in the area. They lose all their sustenance. And these fires, we have to put an end to them. And the herbivory is the way to do it in areas where there's no conflict. And we have plenty of those areas. So in closing, I just want to say thank you for this time. And, if there's any questions, I'll just stand by. Thank you.